Hello, and welcome to the first video of the Stitch the Season workshop for 2022. Now this is a slow stitching workshop that will go over the course of a few weeks where we create a fabric book really based on the images of Christmas. Now you can vary any of the prompts that I show you by taking the prompt and maybe changing it around, making it personal to you. You can base it on a memory or a favorite object or an item. Feel free to change it any way you want. There are no rules. This is a slow stitched book. You can use just fabric and thread, particularly if you're a purist. You can add a few more items, like maybe some beads. Or if you want to go completely mixed media, you can use found objects as well. You can even add paint to your work, if that's the kind of work that you like to do. Now for my book, I'm going to do kind of a mixture of all these things. And I base each page off a prompt. The fabric book itself is 8 pages plus 2 for the cover and the back. So you can use any prompt on any page. Whereas I show the first prompt and I'll put it on maybe the second page, you might want to use that for your cover or your last page or anywhere in between. So anything goes in that way. You might also want to pick and choose which prompts you use. And if there's a particular prompt you really like, you might want to make the whole book based on that prompt. And that is perfectly acceptable. And it's actually kind of unique. So feel free to have fun with this challenge. In today's video, I'm going to show you the basis of making this fabric book. We'll cut our base fabric, and I'm using quilted fabric, but you don't have to. You can use any type of fabric. It's a little different technique for binding this book than in previous videos that I've showed for fabric books. If you prefer to use a specific method, by all means, use that method. You're not required to use the method I'm showing you today. I just wanted to show you a little variation on all the things that you can create using fabric. For today's book, though, I'm going to take a piece of fabric 44 inches long. It goes from one edge of the fabric to the other. So if you were buying it in the fabric store and you buy, say, a yard of fabric, it's the width of the fabric. I like to do this because this way I make an accordion fold of all my fabric to create the book pages. I'll only be sewing on one side of the pages, so the back side won't show. Now with the cover and the back of the book, we'll attach those afterwards. So if you want to use that prompt, I suggest stitching the cover on a separate piece of fabric and then attaching it when we finally attach the cover. And the reason for this is because depending on how you fill your book with different pages, the cover and the spine and the back will be different lengths. I'll show you how I cut the cover at first, a little larger than necessary, and then we'll trim it down when it comes time to attach the cover. I'll also show you what I mean because I'll stitch my cover images and the back image on a separate piece of fabric and then attach it later. So it's very easy to see what I'm talking about. Now I'm going to release videos every other day from now until the workshop is complete. I'll show you all the prompts, how I bind the book finally, and then a final review. I'll also make some accessories throughout the book, little things to tuck in the pockets. And this is where some of the things that I've purchased ahead of time in some of the department stores, etc., come in handy. You can tuck in an ornament or a note to Santa. You get the idea, something along those lines. So this is a really fun activity, and it encompasses a long period of time. And that's one of the reasons I released the video in November. I know the Christmas season doesn't start until a little bit later, unless of course you're a department store, in which case it started at the end of the summer. But for those of you that like to take the holidays one at a time, you can save these videos and watch them when it's appropriate for you. So let's get started creating our book for the Stitch the Season 2022. So to start my album, I'm going to start by making just the structure. And that's the entire basis here, not including the cover. So it's just the pages, but it's the basic structure for the book. Once we have the basic structure set up, we then start the fun part of embellishing each page. Now I've shown different techniques on how to create fabric books on my channel. You can use any of those techniques you want. I'm going to use a slightly different one today, and this uses a long piece of fabric. Now you can obviously stitch pieces of fabric together to create a long piece if you don't have it, but I just use the 44 inches, the length of the folded fabric. So what I did was I took my quilted fabric, because this is what I want as the basis. Now you don't have to use quilted fabric. You can use any type of fabric that you'd like to use, muslin, printed fabric, cotton, anything like that. But I like to use all 44 inches. So that's the entire length of the folded fabric from one selvage to the other. And so what I do then is I just fold it in half. So now this is 22 inches long. And I decide how tall I want my pages. My pages are going to be about 5 inches, between 5 and 5¼ inches wide each page, but the height is very adjustable. So my pages are going to be approximately 5½ inches wide, and I want to make them about 6 inches tall. And I like to start with a larger cut than I plan on using. It's just forgiving that way. So what I do is I line up my fabric so that the top and the bottom are the same. And then I like to use safety pins because I always get poked with the pins. And this is just for the cutting it. If you have a rotary cutter and you'd like to cut it that way, cut it whatever method works for you. I'm just trying to cut the basis of my booklet here. So I'll just plug in these pins. And now I'm going to cut on this line here. And I just used a heat erasable pen. And I can just create that first line, which I have a nice straight line here. And then I'll just measure my 6 inch from the top of that line. Again, this fabric is folded in half right here so that I can get the full length of the 22 inches. And now I'll just create that line. Just like that, and I'll cut on both of those lines to get the height of my book page. So now I have my folded fabric. I'm going to remove these pins, but I'm going to save them because I'm going to use them quite a bit until we're ready to sew the pages. So now I have my fabric folded in half. So I'm going to take this center fold as my guide, make sure my fabric lines up, and then I'm going to take this center fold and fold it in on the top half. And then I'm going to fold it back just one. So I'm making an accordion fold. Now from here, I'll take that fold and fold it over. And I just want to fold it nicely so that all the folds line up. And I'll continue to fold this the entire length of this piece of fabric. Now this is the part where you want to take your time and get those nice folds. So there I have an over and under and over and under all my folds for my pages and the other side. I'm going to start with this open like this. And this is going to be covered with my cover, and this will actually be my first page. So what I need to do now is make this line for each of these pages. I'm going to hold my book completely flat open and create a mark. And on that mark, I'm going to put a safety pin. And that's just so that I don't have to keep folding it over and over while I'm working on it. That safety pin is my guide, and so is that mark. Then over here, I'm going to do the same thing. I have my pages nice and flat, and while I'm adjusting them and creating these lines, I'll just keep readjusting them as I go. Going to make my mark very close to the edge, take a safety pin, and put it right on that mark. And I'll continue doing this all the way down the fabric until I make all the pages. This takes a little bit of prep work, but the result is quite nice. It's very forgiving, so if you feel like you're not doing it correctly, you can easily go back and just check your work. And I can start on this side now as well. That center fold is really imprinted upon that fabric, so I'll switch to this side. And I'll get that line as close to that fold as I can. And then I can just put that safety pin on that side. Now I'm purposely talking you through this stage because it can be a little confusing. I need another fold on this side. And again, I line it up with my previous folds. And I put my pin in position. Again, I fold it over and then just verify that it folds nicely. And it does. So I'll make my fold here. Put my pin in position. And then I need one pin over here. One line and one pin. So I'll verify that shape. And I'll add my last pin. Now, the reason I use the pins is multi-purpose. One, it's a guide for where my pages are so that when my piece opens up, and it will open up, I have each section nicely labeled. I have the line, but because it's a heat-resistant marker, it may fade or get worn off with friction. I know that my pages are going to start on the inside here, so if I only see the metal, I'll know that's the back end of the pages that's not going to show. Now when these are all decorated and stitched, these places with the pins in the center will have a nice fold and it'll be a nice clean edge for my book. So these will be the pieces and the folds from my book, and then we'll have a piece for the cover. So I like to cut all my fabric for my book skeleton and my cover first. I have another piece of fabric here. Now this is much larger than it needs to be. And I choose that larger piece purposely because when it comes time to attach the cover, which is one of the last things we'll do, I want to make sure if I've stuffed my book with all different trinkets and found objects, it'll probably expand, and I want to have enough fabric to cover it. 17 inches gives me plenty of fabric, and I will have to trim it down, but I'm not in jeopardy of it not closing nicely. So I have my book here, and I just want to cut the proper width. So we made this book about 6 inches. I want to make my cover just a little bit larger than 6 inches, so 6.5 inches. So I have my top line yet again, and now I can just measure out my 6.5 inches. I'll do that in a few spots. And then I'll cut my cover down to size. Now all of this can be trimmed in the future if it needs to be. And I'll embellish the cover last because we're not going to know exactly what size that we need to make each page yet or how thick we need to make the spine. So I'm just going to put a pin on my cover and set it aside. The reason I put a pin on it is because this way if I'm working in my studio and I see this piece of fabric, I don't use it for another task. If there's a safety pin in it, it means it's in use or set aside for that purpose, at least in my studio. So I'll set the cover aside for now. Now the last thing I want to do is cut out some fabric that's approximately the size of each of the pages that I'm going to use. I have 10 pages total, and 2 are going to be used on the cover and the back. So I just need to cut out 8 pages that will fit here. I may or may not use them. If you want, you can cut them out as you go. I like to have them cut out ahead of time. It kind of coordinates the pages and it gives me something to work on. I'm going to cut all of my pages from this muslin fabric, and I can either stitch directly on the muslin and then attach it to the page, or I can stitch directly on the page, or I can stitch it directly on the page as I go. I'm going to cut out my 8 pages that are approximately 6 by 5, and that will give me a lot to work with here. So I'll cut those out and it'll be ready to go. The other thing I'd like to do is go through my fabric, and I have 2 or 3 other fabrics that I plan on using for the majority of the book, and if I want to cut those as background pieces, well, I'll do that now as well. So I've cut a couple of each of these patterned fabrics into little page sizes, and as you can see, they're not precisely cut. I'll trim them down as I use them. And then I have 8 of these muslin cuts. And these are going to be the backing on these pages. Now I don't have to use them. I can stitch directly on my quilted fabric. It's really an option. In the next video, we'll start with our first prompt. Now the prompts can be stitched, as I said, directly on your book page, or they can be stitched here. Ultimately, the back of each of the pages will be hidden, so it's not a problem either way. You won't have the background showing. So once you have your book, I like to keep my supplies that I'm using currently in a bin very close to my work table, and I'll pull them out each day to work on each of the prompts. So those are all the materials that I used to make the book, how I cut them down to size, how I pin them, and now I have a blank canvas to work on. In the next video, we'll start our prompts. I'll give you the first prompt and show you how I execute it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Please be sure to subscribe so you can get notified of all the videos in this series. Thanks for joining me today.